Welcome, everybody. This is Ben Scallan, and you're watching Gript Media. I'm joined today by Mr. Tim Andrews of IGO Watch. Very good to speak to you, Tim.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So today we're going to be talking about the World Health Organization and their apparent links to China in covering up the coronavirus. But before we begin, Tim, a quick bit of background on yourself and your organization. If you could tell us a little bit about IGO Watch, what does the IGO stand for, and what sort of work does the organization do?
Absolutely. So IGO Watch was started originally as a project of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, which is a taxpayer group in Washington, D.C., as an international watchdog to look at all of these international governmental organizations, all of these international bureaucracies that our taxpayers, our taxes fund, and yet seem to do very, very little other than waste our money on lavish expenses for themselves and fail at their core missions. So we have 24 partners around the world in 18 different countries. I know the Edmund Burke Institute in Ireland is one of our local partners. They're doing some great work. So we try and leverage all of these international partners to see what these groups are doing, because everyone focuses on the big ones like the UN or the European Union, but there are all of these other bureaucracies and these agencies that get billions and billions of dollars, and nobody is really investigating them. So we started this up at the start of 2018, and one of the things that we learned very, very quickly was how of all of these agencies, the World Health Organization was one of the worst in terms of gross abuses of taxpayer funding. And we've now seen the inevitable result of this in terms of their failings over COVID-19.
That's amazing, because I think a lot of ordinary people who maybe aren't very political, or people who they get their news from quite a narrow selection of sources, would be of the opinion that these are very reputable institutions that are extremely competent at what they do, and they're kind of the leading authorities in the world on the issues that they assign themselves to. But your organization has issued an open letter to the heads of world governments calling for an international investigation into the WHO. So if you could tell me a little bit about that letter and why you think the WHO should be investigated.
Absolutely. So what we've uncovered and what we discussed in the letter is that the World Health Organization has a track record of failure, mismanagement, and waste of taxpayer funds that ends up costing lives. Firstly, we saw this going back to Ebola. When Ebola broke out, there were leaked emails that came out which showed the World Health Organization refused to declare a public health emergency because it didn't want to offend local politicians who were scared about losing tourism revenue. They were delayed for 3 months because they didn't want to offend their stakeholders and their tourism revenue, and thousands of people died as a direct result of their inaction. So we've now seen this at a much broader scale, where the WHO has now essentially become their leadership bought and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, where for weeks and weeks they were, while China was imprisoning whistleblower doctors, while they were arresting journalists who tried to raise the alarm, the World Health Organization was praising the Chinese Communist Party transparency and political leadership, which was a lie. They opposed declaring it a public health emergency at the request of the Chinese government. They didn't send an advance team into China until over a month after this was spread, again at the request of China. They refused to listen to the evidence from Taiwan, which was one of the most successful at dealing with COVID-19, and they kept ignoring the letters from Taiwan as to how to deal with this and covering those up again at the request of Beijing. So you saw them issuing press statements that travel restrictions were racist, when we know countries that have done them, like Australia, they worked quite well. You saw them bending over backwards over this, and you look at this in terms of following the money. While Western countries fund the WHO, the Chinese Communist Party has been a lot more clever and strategic about this, in that they simply give money to the countries of all the leaders, because it's an elected thing. Every country gets one vote, so they just buy off all the original individual countries. So Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, was the Chinese Communist Party candidate. You look at all of the media there. Around the time, China was pushing him because coincidentally, he was a minister in the Marxist government there that received billions of dollars in Chinese funding. As soon as he got elected, what was the very first thing he did? His very first press release was, "We will never recognize Taiwan." And a couple of weeks after that, he made, at the request of China, and this is all documented at the time, brutal dictator Robert Mugabe a goodwill ambassador for the World Health Organization. Again, at the request of China, because he was a Chinese ally. China repaid his country of Ethiopia by then saying, "Oh, we'll pay for WHO another $80 million for WHO Health Center in Africa." So the entire leadership of the WHO essentially has just became a puppet for the Chinese regime. Thirdly, though, you look at where the money's actually spent. They claim to be reputable experts doing. They spend more than almost $30,000 a year on travel per person across their entire employ. Now, Doctors Without Borders, it's about $1,200. Instead, the WHO, again, this is all revealed in leaked emails and internal documents, they spend more on travel than they do on tuberculosis, hepatitis, AIDS, and malaria combined. Flying first class in your $10,000, $15,000 flights are common. When going back to Ebola, one of their people went through $400,000 pretty much on private helicopters because he thought he was too important to travel by jeep. So there's an email from him saying he didn't want to travel along muddy roads on a jeep. And so he went through close to $400,000 at a time when all the stuff on the ground was doctors were saying, we can't afford the basic necessities to treat patients. And then you go through close to $500,000 on private helicopters because you think you're too important to. And interestingly, that same person, if you saw the video, because it went viral about 2 weeks ago, of the WHO official who kept pretending to drop out when he was asked questions about Taiwan. So that's the same person.
Wow.
So that was the same person who felt he was too important to travel by jeep. Still in a job, so no questions of accountability. And this is the thing, there's no accountability or there's no transparency with these organizations. They don't let reporters, journalists, observers go to any of their meetings. The very first of any of the WHO meetings, the first motion they do is, we're now going to ban all journalists and all observers from the rooms. So they have behind the, like, how can you have accountability and transparency in this sort of a situation? And yet it's almost inevitable that you're going to see, when you've got this culture of secrecy, you've got this culture of essentially bribing countries for votes, but you're going to see public health disasters like this one occur.
Well, it's astonishing when you think about the decadence that you're describing, considering the fact that the WHO's director, who you mentioned, Tedros Adhanom, as you know, I'm sure, was the Ethiopian health minister before he was the director of the WHO, and he was a high-ranking member of a violent Marxist-Leninist political party. And so, I guess when you think about that,
he also covered up 3 cholera outbreaks.
Absolutely.
So one of the other things that he was here, he has form in trying to cover up public health emergencies, because we know he did it 3 times where there was a public health emergency in Ethiopia. He tried to hush it up and refused to take the necessary steps to address it.
Well, I believe it's alleged. He was accused by by detractors, but certainly.
That's true. But I think the evidence that's been presented about that, I think after the New York Times or one of those papers ended up doing an investigation that found that the evidence is pretty compelling that he did that. So I'm happy. I agree it's alleged. It hasn't been proven in a court of law or anything, but I'm fairly confident that the evidence is sufficient that it's part of a track record by Dr. Tedros.
Well, considering his background, what would you say? Do you think that it's reasonable for a communist, a self-described communist, to deal with the world's largest communist regime, the Chinese Communist Party, honestly? Do you think that there's any kind of conflict of interest there?
Well, of course there is. And I mean, there's a reason why the Chinese Communist Party chose him as this candidate, because they knew that he would do anything that they told him to do. He was sympathetic to them, and then he had that conflict of interest. That's why China spent so much money trying to buy him the votes necessary so that he would win. And this is part of the program that China has had to try and take over these international organizations. I mean, they already run directly 4 of the main UN sub-agencies. through proxies they control a few more. They almost, and I still can't believe it, they almost succeeded in taking over the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization a couple of weeks ago. Like China, the world's biggest thief of intellectual property, almost took over the World Intellectual Property Organization. I mean, this is a deliberate strategy that they're using to put their appointments into all of these key places. And idiot Western countries, we still keep giving money to these organizations. China gives, gives virtually nothing to these organizations, and they just buy off the individual people involved.
Well, as you know, President Donald Trump in the US has announced he will be suspending all funding to the WHO, and I've heard speculation that could be indefinite, that they might not be giving them another cent. And our government here in Ireland is very anti-Trump, anti-American in a lot of ways, and almost as if to spite America, our Minister for Foreign Affairs has announced that we'll be quadrupling our national contributions to the World Health Organization. So what would you say to countries that are considering doing something like that? Or if you could have a direct line to any of these government officials, what would you say to them?
I mean, that what you said, I mean, that's really a case of, cutting off your, cutting off your ear to spite the face. Cutting off your nose to spite the face is the same, because this shouldn't be a political issue. This isn't a question of right or left. It's a question of right or wrong. The issues of transparency, accountability, not wasting taxpayer money on luxury travel as people are suffering, of not covering up pandemics and helping dictators, of an organization which, I mean, has a track record. But there's never been a dictator that the WHO doesn't like. They literally praised North Korea after 2 million people died of famine for combating obesity. So there are statements from the WHO praising North Korea's fight against obesity. True, like, this is insane. Like, shouldn't be a political issue. Like, right or left wing politics, it doesn't matter. Like, everyone agrees that North Korea, bad. 2 million people, bad, dead, bad. Anyone who believes in good government accountability should look at reforming the WHO, or perhaps finding an alternative. Now, I can understand why a lot of countries like Ireland believe in international response to these issues, and there might be a way of coordinating these internationally, but do it through a mechanism which actually has transparency and accountability, work with like-minded countries, provide resources for groups like Doctors Without Borders that actually have doctors on the ground helping people in these developing countries, and do it without all the bloated middleman overheads that the World Health Organization has. We all want what's good for public health. We all want to save lives. And it's clear that the WHO is not doing that. Giving them more money will be money wasted. And it's not just a question of it being money wasted. It's any dollar you spend on them is a dollar that won't get to people who actually need it. It is a dollar that will be spent on luxury travel and those sorts of things rather than providing relief. So by quadrupling money to the WHO, the Irish government is essentially taking money away from people who need health services. And it's something that will actually cost lives rather than save.
Absolutely. Well, macroing out then briefly, the theme I noticed with a lot of the organizations that IGO Watch is critical of, when you think about the UN, the WHO, the European Union, all of these different supranational bodies and internationalist bodies, the theme that you notice is globalism and globalization. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think the coronavirus pandemic will affect globalization and people's attitudes towards it going forward into the future?
I mean, there are sort of, when we say globalization, I would argue that there's sort of what could be good globalization and what's really, really bad globalization and supranationalism. So the fact that you have all of these unelected, undemocratic, non-transparent, organized supranational organizations, which we fund, but we have no democratic control over them. That's a key example of bad globalization. That's a key example of what I hope people wake up to and start realizing that we need to combat. Because originally these organizations actually served some good, right? Like 50 and 70 years ago, the WHO, back when it did its job of fighting pandemics, But then you didn't have this bloated bureaucracy. You didn't have it trying to issue edicts over people's lives. You didn't have the WHO putting all of its money into why we need an international meat tax, because, true story, according to the WHO, bacon is in the same cancer-causing category as plutonium. And that's why we need a new international meat tax. So they overstepped their boundaries. They created these bureaucracies, and it's all about taking away our democratic freedom and trying to impose these laws about the entire society. Like, there's a lot of others in this space, like where, you know, the EU at the moment is pushing for this new rule to, ban a form of, just use as an example, to ban new products. Like, there's this silicon medical product that the EU wants to ban all over the world, despite having great medical advice. There's been no argument why that it's actually harmful. They just think, let's just ban this because we don't like science. So you're seeing all food regulation, international meat tax, carbon taxes, all of these things that want to be imposed without democratic control. So that's what we hope people will realize is bad. That's what we hope people will start to combat against this level of undemocratic unaccountability. Now, I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there is, international cooperation with our allies, trading with our allies is a good thing. I mean, there has been great benefits from these sorts of things throughout the world. So I would think that, we need to, my view is, I mean, if you want to look at how to combat the rise of China economically, that's a very good example of having international trading partnerships to try and arrest the rise of China. So that's an argument where, if we have our like-minded allies in a trading bloc, that's something which is a form of good globalization. It also, because we get the benefits of trade, we also get to do it for geopolitical and geostrategic reasons to try and combat China. And we're doing it in a much more sophisticated way than just trying to slap tariffs on things and hurting consumers in the process. So bad globalization, hopefully people now, once they look at how bad the WHO has been, they'll think, well, what about all the other agencies that we pay for? And it will start people thinking, and starting to connect the dots. So that's what we hope will happen.
Fantastic. Well, here's hoping. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tim. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
God bless.
Thank you.